Our next speaker is Anirudh. I'll let him introduce himself, and he's going to talk about tech and. Yeah. Thank you. Can I take the mic off? Yeah, sure. You can move around if you want. Yeah. There you go.
This meant do a slide.
Oh, this is on, right?
Yeah, it's on, but the clicker isn't working. So if you will have
Yeah.
to move, come back.
That's fine.
Yeah, it started working.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone. I guess I'll give everyone like 2 minutes because I know people would rather eat snacks than listen to me. So, okay. Yeah, if that's everyone, yeah, I'll just let you sit down and then we can get started. Yeah. My charity work for the year. Okay, cool. So, yeah, thanks, Abhi. That was a pretty comprehensive view of progress, but I think my talk is going to be a little more provocative, and that's just the way I like it. So, yeah, today I'll be talking about, has technology replaced global sovereignty? And this is kind of, it's not really one of these things that people want to talk about in 15 minutes, but I think, this is just one man's view of the world. But let me just quickly define what sovereignty means, because I know that that's not really a common term we use on the West Coast. And sovereignty is this idea of the state having certain powers. So it's kind of instantiated with what they call the ultimate authority to govern. But then, that's instantiated in different ideas, and we'll talk about that. But essentially, you can kind of rephrase this question to be, has technology replaced and almost superseded the various powers that states govern with? So that's another way you can look at the question. And yeah, I don't want to go in my background too much because I don't want to color this talk more than it's already biased. So we can leave that if you're interested to the end. So a big portion of this, I think, is I don't know how many of you. I mean, you all probably read Stratechery, and if you don't, it's a blog by this guy Ben Thompson, who recently did something very interesting where he discussed the idea of the first, second, and third estates, but applied to modern society. And so, for those who don't know, the first, second, and third estate was a term that Marx used in pre-revolutionary France, where the first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the noblemen, noble people in France. Third estate were like the poor, broke peasants, the proletariat, while the first estate was essentially the bourgeoisie. But today, something that's very interesting today, and I think one reason it's so exciting in our times, like the Chinese curse, is that we kind of see that religion is falling away. That the idea of religion, is this transient object. And religion doesn't really play a part anymore. I mean, it doesn't really shape the modern collective as much as technology does. So you can kind of look at this, idea of religion falling away as it slowly becomes non-existent. What's taken its place, as Dostoevsky said, is that, we all need to worship something. People are, by its very nature, religious. Like, man is a religious creature. And so what I think has taken the place and what is superseded, as you can see in this chart, more or less, is that technology has almost superseded the state. And that's kind of my thesis that we can explain. So before, priests were the top, in every country in the world, there's this idea of religion at the top. But to some degree, that power and that unbridled authority to rule has now been taken over by technology. So yeah, one reason I think this is provocative is also, so I'm going to give you an analogy using Genesis from the Bible. And so there's this interesting part in Genesis where they discuss Babel. And for those who don't know and who haven't, I'm sure a lot of people haven't read the Bible. And an interesting part of this is that Babel, so way back in the day, before any of us can remember, people all spoke one language. And it was this act of globalization that we had way back before there were any nation states. And when we had all of these people together, people work together. That's kind of another part of Genesis is, man was made to work. And so what's one thing he did? He built a tower to reach heaven. And so everyone in Genesis is working together to build this tower to get to heaven. But what does God do? He acts almost like the Leviathan and just comes in and destroys the tower. So you can kind of see that even in the days before society, that there was this innate idea of people, of globalization, of one world, but also that world being basically destroyed by an outside force, by this exogenous element, like the Leviathan that just comes out of nowhere and destroys this idea of globalization. And so again, that's why it was called Babel, because there, the Lord confuses the language of the world. And that's one analogy that I think will actually become more clear as I continue. So I think good questions are better than good answers. I know I don't have that much time, but I think if you can get anything out of this talk, I think I'd want to illuminate two of these ideas. And so the first, obviously, is why has, since World War II, American self-belief kind of gone in the way of the gutter? And the second idea is more or less why big tech companies now are basically the giants of the modern day ecosystem, economic ecosystem, and while the state is more like, a puny, basically like a puny midget in relation to these big tech companies. And so I hope, a good question, something that reminds me obviously is, I'm sure everyone here has read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I think when everyone talks about that famous part of the book, 42, it kind of tells you that the question was just a dumb question. There's no one meaning of life. And when you're looking at something as complex as tech, geopolitics, heck, even religion, there's no just one answer to this. And so if you can ask better questions by the end of this talk, I hope that, I've done my job. So yeah, just very quickly, what got us here. And so this is more an understanding of pre-modern globalization that I think would put everyone on the same page with all of our various backgrounds. So pre-1914, one thing that we see is, at around 1870, America takes the lead as the world's largest GDP. And at that time, Britain, it was Britain before, and then it became America. And at this time, we had exactly a similar situation to what we have today. So Rockefeller, we had Carnegie, US Iron and Steel, we had JP Morgan, and all of these players controlled a way larger portion of the economy than our big tech companies did today. And even more interesting at this time, what I find is that, we had the scramble for Africa. The world was not discovered yet. It was at the similar time that Shackleton does his daring voyage across Antarctic. And at the same time, all of these European powers are colonizing the world. We also see that, the UK also in 1900 had a 4% current account surplus. What that means in English is essentially that, they had a savings surplus of 4%. And the world actually worked back then. We had developed countries invest in developing countries, not like today. And so they use this money for in Argentina, in Russian railroads. That's how the world should work. And 1914 kind of breaks the world. So that's the first time that we see even this idea of the Leviathan, and kind of that there's this breaking of globalization. And so one thing that's super interesting to me is just the idea of the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And people don't know just how expansive it was. So one thing that was interesting is that, it increased almost 1,000 import tariffs by about 50%. That's pretty crazy. I mean, imagine doing something like that today. That's nearly unimaginable to global trade. And it does take a hit, just like you can imagine, the idea of globalization basically falls away. And after that, so after 1945, the story gets even more interesting. And so what we kind of see is that at this time, we really see America take the lead as the global superpower. So if you can harken back to about 5 seconds ago where I said, that America was the world's largest GDP after 1870, we then see that it was only after World War II that America really becomes the top dog that everyone kind of knows about. So one thing that I'll also talk about, and in a bit more detail, is how at this time, we become just the de facto leaders of the world. But something that slips our grasp is China. And China comes essentially out of nowhere and basically takes over. And now we've gone full circle. In 100 years, our belief in globalization has also fallen away. And that's something we'll discuss more in depth. So post-World War II, so a lot of this is taken from Peter Zian's idea of the modern world. And one thing that he very cleverly discusses is that, so you're taught in history that, there's Caesar, there's Alexander the Great, but all of these people, they did not control the world as much as America did 1945 post-atom bomb. The level of control America had is like pretty indescribable to most people, just because it's every single major player in the world is either destroyed, incapacitated, or communist, which is arguably worse than both of the above. And so to put in perspective, physically, America is the best. Why? Because we have troops in all of these countries. I won't list them out, but you can kind of see that every basically modern country in the world has American troops. But what does that actually mean? It means that, like we have today, we basically have this soft power in every major country, which is indescribable before that. And even through this, even in total decimation, these European states still controlled a fourth of the global economy, while America had control basically of over all of them. And funny enough, looking back, it's the USSR that only came close with their output physically. But even at their peak, they still had less than a third of what the US produced in a single year. And that's, when Stalin is brutally, murdering everyone, reducing this arbitrage, it's still less than a third of what the US had. And I think that's super interesting. But, as I said before, and I think Orwell actually, I'm not really a fan of Orwell's fiction works, but I think what he says in his nonfiction works are much better. And one idea that I think he talks about is, to see what is in front of one's nose requires a constant struggle. If you slip up for a second, it's like Andy Grove said, only the paranoid survive. But we weren't paranoid, we lost that. And I think that's one reason that we're in dire straits right now, like in the Odyssey. So this is China, and the blue line is America. Like I think everyone here can read a chart. I don't really need to tell you what's going on. I mean, this is pretty crazy. Like this is not even the Asian tiger story of the Southeast Asian countries. This is something else. And all our politicians knew about this. They get this graph every year. They have advisors telling them about this, but they didn't care. Why is that? And how did this is a deeper story of geopolitics. Why did America let this happen? Why China, and why not any other country? And I think this is something to think about, that, in 2014, China becomes the world's largest GDP. But does it do anything like the world's largest superpower? I mean, does it care about the climate? No. Does it care about human rights? I mean, obviously not. Any idea of China becoming a global superpower is pretty ridiculous when you think about it, because if you imagine, the US is pretty welcoming with other foreign powers after the war. We opened up trade, we gave them security, we had all of these neoliberal institutions, which, didn't really work out, but we let other people compete. And China does the exact opposite. So that's just something to think about, and I think something to ponder. So Shakespeare was actually referring to King Henry when he wrote, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown," but I think it actually applies very well to modern big technology today. So just like China, tech comes gradually and then suddenly all at once. And way back in the day, I don't know if we all probably know the story of Martin Luther, but it was a church really that controlled the spread of information technology as we know it back then. And it was Gutenberg who was really the first guy to let normal people, he was like the original, I guess, European Prometheus. And if you think about that, it was one, you could say the church is the most successful startup of all time because of the amount of control that they had over information technology. And that's why we had the first and second estates have that much power for the longest time. But today is starkly different. So we have these tech firms like Facebook and Google who, remember what I said about sovereignty. So sovereignty is this idea of the powers that are instantiated by the state. So what makes a state a state? There are certain powers that we've all, like a social contract signed into, whether you like it or not. There's a reason we pay our taxes, even though Bernie Sanders might not like that so much. So as we see here, so these tech firms, a lot of them have slowly unbundled the power of states. And cities can't do anything about it. So like, if you think, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, there was a very small, but I think in my opinion, very important case with Belgium and Google. So the Belgian publishers, obviously, like most journalists, are just angry about all things. So they complain about Google and they're saying, oh, can you pay us for having our articles on your site? And what does Google do? They don't even respond. They don't care, because the Belgian government to Google doesn't mean anything. It actually, like Hegel says, means less than nothing. So it actually probably lets them do whatever they want because they know that they have the power, and their lack of actual power makes it more clear that Google can just do whatever they want. But all is not well. So the crown obviously gives you a very uneasy power. And so One thing that they did very wrong is, so if you think back to, I think it was 1970 when we're first breaking up AT&T, right, with Bell Labs, and think how ludicrous it actually is. So if I was to, let's say, communicate hate messages over the phone, and you would never hold AT&T accountable for that, right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you hold a phone company, a telecommunications company, responsible for sending hate mail through the object? That doesn't make sense to me. But Facebook and Google they intervened when they shouldn't have. You know, I think it was also this year, Google said that they don't actually influence search results. Like, how, I mean, it's only American politicians that would believe that. So what does that tell you? You know, they overplayed their hand. And just like in poker, if you do that, even with a pair of aces, you're screwed. And that's essentially what both of them did. You know, they overplayed their hand. And only you can kind of say that Apple really hasn't. But all of these players, they know that the clock is ticking, that slowly and surely, there's only, you know, you can either get better or you can get worse. And so that's why all of these big tech companies realize that a lot of their power comes from they have to keep taking more of it. And so Apple is building mini cities. You know, recently that they had a $2 billion expansion in Cupertino, and it was only states that had these powers before. And we all know that the congressional hearings are a big farce. You know, so it was, I think, Marx who said history begins first as tragedy, then as farce. And this is exactly what we're seeing right now, where the congressional hearings mean, again, less than nothing. It's anything like you know, good reality TV. So one thing that I think, and I guess to draw it more so full circle, is that internet power is obviously stronger than state power. And so this is also based off of Balaji's, I think, talk 2 years ago, so Balaji Srinivasan from Coinbase, where he said, you know, on the path to decentralizing the world, tech has basically made the idea of a nation state redundant. And why do I say that? It's because look at telepresence tools, look at things like Zoom, look at things like telemedicine, look at things like, you know, the fact that you can still move money from China to the US without the government. It's simple, it's called crypto. So making a unified decentralized currency is actually just a start. And that's not even where the end goal lies. It's the idea of making location entirely unimportant. You know, before, you know, even before the Industrial Revolution, if you were born in what would now be like, say, a seventh world country, you know, I don't mean to be derogative, but like, if you were born in a country like that, there's no nice ways to put it. You can slice it and dice it however you want. You're probably going to die very early of like tuberculosis. Like, you had no chance at life. But now we can actually kind of instantiate this idea of the American model. You know, Balaji's idea was using the cloud and kind of having opt-in and easy exits instead of nation states. And I can keep going and talking about how that's going to work, but for the sake of time. So one thing I think was interesting, so we know how Mark Andreessen said software eats the world, but I actually like Mark's corollary that I just made up 5 seconds ago, which is whoever owns our software becomes the de facto ruler of the world. So whoever owns, as we see, you know, in the FANG companies, whoever owns the software, as we see actually very recently with WhatsApp and the Sri Lankan terrorist attacks, they want access to WhatsApp and to break the encryption. But is it going to happen? I think, as we know, that history replays itself, and history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And so they're not going to get it because they're not more powerful than Facebook, and they can try, but they're going to miserably fail. And so it's, again, full circle. So China knows this, and that's why they're spending billions of dollars not competing purely on the internet, but on combining the internet and actually the world of atoms. And so that's why they're spending billions of dollars as well on nuclear, on AI, on gene editing, things that our politicians don't even care about. And just fundamentally, we still need to make sure that the best ideas come to America, because if they're not, I mean, I don't want to think about a world where, you know, China and essentially, let's not put it nicely, but it's not just China, it's basically Xi can put anyone in a camp when he wants to. And I think history has actually said something about that. But yeah, thanks. I'll kind of skip this, but because we kind of know that what happens, Babel is destroyed, God and the state. And yeah, thanks.